Wherever you may be in Canada, good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. Welcome to the second day of Canada West Foundation's symposium. This symposium is being held as part of a work integrated master's project with a final paper to be written by Stephanie Lavery, who's a senior policy analyst with the Canada West Foundation. My name is Gary Marr. I'm the president and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. Our moderator later this morning is going to be the Honorable Erin O'Toole. In case you missed it yesterday, Mr. O'Toole moderated a session with the three premiers of Western Canada, being the Honorable Christy Clark, the Honorable Ed Stelmach, and the Honorable Gary Dewar. I know a number of people that are signed up for today's two-part session, the first on cabinet members and the second on caucus members. Many of you would have watched yesterday's event, but there are more people registered for today than there were yesterday. And so we know that there are some people that didn't get a chance to watch yesterday's. And so we invite you to go to our archives, and you'll be able to find it up on our website in the near future. Let me say that Canada West Foundation is a donor-driven organization. We do public policy work, and we focus on the issues on Western Canada, the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. We strive to bring you material and content that is both relevant and interesting and timely. And if you like what you watch today, please don't hesitate to make a donation to the Canada West Foundation. Hit the donate button on our website, cwf.ca. I'm now going to turn it over to our moderator, Erin O'Toole, and our first group of panelists, which are former members of Executive Council from different provinces across the West. Erin O'Toole, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much to the Honorable Gary Marr and to the Canada West Foundation for this incredible series on examining our provincial governments, and particularly the role that elected officials, members of the executive, and the premiers play in building trust and building public policy through the establishment of trust in our public institutions. What a great time to do this. Certainly in the last few years, we've heard a lot of concern about an erosion of trust, not just in public figures, but in our institutions, even our justice system. Conversations like these are the ways we can make sure that we educate people on where our system is doing well, where we need to improve it, and just the valuable goal of public service. Yesterday's panel with the three premiers was an excellent overview of the challenges of leadership and of public life, but also the positives. We ended on a really positive note for each of the premiers in how they view their legacy in many ways, building their provinces for the future. And it's a reminder that public service is a noble calling, despite what they might say on Twitter/X. Today, we have a really interesting panel that is going to explore the role of cabinet and the executive team for a province. And we've got great representation from around the Western provinces. I'm just going to introduce each of them very, very briefly, and then hopefully they can speak a little more to their cabinet experience during our open discussion. But first, we have Ken Krawitz, who was an MLA and cabinet minister in Saskatchewan, many portfolios, including finance. Stephanie McLean from Alberta served as an MLA and as a member of cabinet, a number of portfolios, including Service Alberta. Greg Wiedak, former MLA from Alberta and cabinet minister, including portfolios like advanced education. We have Dave Chomiak from Manitoba, who had quite a few cabinet portfolios across his distinguished career, including health and justice. And finally, we have Susan Anton from British Columbia, who also served in cabinet in senior roles in justice and as the Attorney General. So I'd like to welcome you all and perhaps start this way. You know, we spoke to the premiers yesterday. We're speaking to a backbench panel next. the Premier's executive team is cabinet. And our interesting discussion yesterday, Premier Clark talked about how after a fairly heated leadership race, she came in with only one supporter in a caucus that she was then charged with leading. Each of the former premiers actually spoke about how they tried to engage their former rivals from leadership races. Why don't each of you share a few thoughts on how you came to join the executive committee, how you came to cabinet? Some people come in a sweep election and their first job is a cabinet portfolio on top of being an MLA. Others have worked their way up through the trenches from a backbench to a parliamentary assistant or secretary role to that big promotion to cabinet. So why don't we go around the horn, starting in the far west. Suzanne, what was your experience joining cabinet and becoming Attorney General for British Columbia?
Well, it was, as they say, drinking out of a fire hose. I had been in local government. I was in city government in Vancouver for 9 years, but I had not been in provincial government. So there were quite a number of things that were very challenging to start with. I will say, and you probably heard this from Premier Clark yesterday, we had a very clear agenda in British Columbia. We had two things we needed to do. One was get LNG underway, which we did. And the second was balance the budget, which we did. So those big priority items were very clear to us. But it was the other things that, that we will, everyone here in cabinet will know that you've got the big priority things, but you also have all the sort of routine things that you have to do. And it was working with cabinet, working with caucus, which could be quite challenging. You might think something was a great idea and no one else did. So I think in terms of the theme of trust, there is an element that the public doesn't see, which is that a lot of the stuff that you work through as a cabinet minister, you have worked through with your caucus, and they've either told you to take a hike, or they've told you how to make it better, or they've told you, or they've supported it. And the same thing for cabinet. Cabinet has to like where you're going as well. So these ideas, before they're presented to the public, are very well worked over in both caucus and cabinet. And that was interesting to me. I kind of thought, well, people would think that I knew what I was doing and they would defer to me. But sometimes they do, but often they don't, because they know in their own constituencies that that's not going to work.
Well said. Sometimes the discussions with caucus can be your dress rehearsal before the public press conference. That's great, great perspective. How about you, Dave? Did you have the same experience where you came in and went into cabinet quite quickly, or did you climb the ladder, so to speak, before getting the big jobs like health and justice?
So I had the fortunate experience of working for 3 different governments prior to being elected, then had 9 years in opposition with Gary Dewar. So when we formed government in 1999, I was pretty well familiar, and I was fortunate because I had been through those experiences with 3 different governments. So I had a bit of an upper hand in that sense. So it was fortunate because healthcare became our biggest priority, and that was what I was assigned to do. With respect to caucus and cabinet, a couple things that I did do as a result of my experience was first to use a well-worn metaphor, happy caucus equals happy political life. So I knew how important it was to keep caucus on side and to be forthright and work with them. The other thing that I did a lot in cabinet was because I was trained in law and I was just temperamental about everything I read, before decisions were made in cabinet, I tended, much to the chagrin of my colleagues, I think, to try to sum up all of the arguments and conceptualize what we had decided. And for me, that was very important in terms of understanding completely as we came out of cabinet and caucus as to where we were going. So it was a great experience, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. And I never thought, indeed I knew, I was never the smartest person in the room. There was always people around me, both in the public service, in cabinet, in caucus, who knew more than I. And so that was my experience.
Well, great comments, Dave. And before I move on to our next panelist, let me ask you that quintessential question. You spent 9 years in opposition before your time in government. Is the old axiom true that the best days in opposition is is not as good as the worst day in government?
Well, I'm of two minds. From a personal standpoint, it was always better in opposition because you could go home at night. But really, our job was to deliver for our constituents and for the province, and working those hours were worth it in terms of providing the results that the public had asked for.
Great comment. Next panelist, we'll go to you, Greg. In your experience in Alberta, joining cabinet, was it quick? Was it gradual? And when you got advanced education, for example, did you have any background, or was this an assignment that the Premier gave you with a specific mandate?
Well, thank you. And yeah, I started out with 3 terms on Lethbridge City Council, so I got my feet wet that way, and it really gives you a good opportunity to work with the provincial government and ministers on a bunch of things that impact your community. And then was elected in 2008 with Premier Ed Stelmach and a great team of progressive conservatives in Alberta. I was very fortunate that right on my first election, I was appointed chair of a cabinet policy committee, which makes you responsible for 5 or 6 cabinet ministers. And all of the policies they bring forward have to be vetted through our committee before it can go to cabinet. So we vetted the legislation. We sat at the cabinet table to explain it at times. And so it was immediately the opportunity to be at cabinet. And then I moved up from there to be Doug Horner's parliamentary assistant. And I don't think you could work with a better cabinet minister to learn the ropes. What a wonderful guy to work with. And as his parliamentary assistant, I got to work with all of the colleges and universities and technology in the province. And then ultimately, I was appointed to his position when he stepped back to run for premier. And I became the Minister of Advanced Education and Technology, and probably one of the best jobs I ever had. I loved the whole world around research and universities, and just can't say enough about the great research being done across Western Canada and all of the provinces that I think a lot of people don't know about. So great opportunity to get into cabinet and move up kind of slowly and learn as I went.
That's a really good background, and similar to mine. You know, I spent time in backbench and then parliamentary secretary, as we call them federally. Then I got the nod to go into cabinet from Prime Minister Harper, and sometimes that's a little easier than the fire hose that Suzanne talked about. And your policy work on those that chair role, where you would work with cabinet ministers, gave you a great exposure to how the process went. And the only disagreement I have, Minister Horner, I heard, was the best, but the real best to work for was the Honorable Gary Marr, from what I've heard. He may be listening in, so I'm putting that out there for his consideration. Let's go to Stephanie and your experience. Obviously, same province. We're talking Alberta as well. Was your experience similar to Greg's in terms of some time in as an MLA and within the legislative cycle, or did you get a really quick acceleration to cabinet?
Yeah, so when I was elected in 2015, a very small cabinet was chosen, taking into account all the sort of regular things, gender, ethnicity, geography, all of those factors. And I was not brought into cabinet right away. I was given the role of deputy whip. And the premier told me that essentially this was an opportunity for me to cut my teeth and sort of show my abilities with sort of the potential of cabinet, being the carrot, right? So I did that, and the whip was Marlon Schmidt out of Edmonton. So we worked really closely together to ensure caucus solidarity and that caucus understood their role. Of course, only 4 of our entire elected had been elected previously, so this was no small feat. I was a lawyer that came from private practice, and I was only 28 when we were brought in. We were sort of, the NDP was like the dog chasing the car, and we thought we were going to be opposition, and then we caught the car, and so it was a whirlwind. And I definitely, showed my my loyalty and my tenacity in the deputy whip role. And then I was, in the very first cabinet edition, brought in as Minister of Status of Women and Service Alberta. And as an aside, I was 9 months pregnant and 3 days out from giving birth. And I called my midwife the night before because I was having Braxton Hicks, and I was like, I'm in Edmonton. I should be in Calgary. I know you wouldn't approve me to have traveled, but will I be okay? Should I come back? And anyway, it was fine. The baby waited.
Wow, that is quite an adventure. Let me ask one more question before I go on, because you had to kind of work your way into cabinet, but also with that caucus officer position of deputy whip, did that help you get a real feeling for where caucus would be on certain pieces of legislation because you'd been part of kind of the caucus discipline process?
Yeah, discipline's a really good word for it, and it definitely helped me understand it. But not only that, I was really one of them. We were a bunch of activists who were running for the cause. Nobody at that time, very few I think at that time, who had been recruited for the NDP in Alberta thought that it was a slam dunk that they were going to get elected. I think that was probably the case for many of the progressive conservatives historically, safe seats, safe ridings, those kinds of things. So we were all very much there for the cause. Everybody had their agenda of what it was that they wanted to achieve, and I was no different. So I appreciated that personally. So it definitely gave me that insight, as you say. I will say, if I was close to some of my colleagues who got swept into cabinet right away. And for all of us who had zero experience of being in an elected role, I would say it was easier on those of us who came in and were not swept into cabinet right away. We actually had time to set up our constituency offices. We had time to really get the idea of retail politics, to get to know our constituencies in a way that those who were swept into cabinet didn't have those same perspectives and advantages. So it, I think, helped me balance the two roles once I was put into cabinet.
Thanks, Stephanie. A little political war story. I was in Ukraine with Prime Minister Harper and with Minister Kenny. We'd come from doing some stuff with veterans in Europe. We were at the inauguration of President Poroshenko when the Alberta election happened. And I'll never forget, on the plane back, Jason Kenney was kind of teasing Stephen Harper that he now had partners and NDP MLAs in his riding federally, but Jason didn't. That was quite an earth-shattering election, and I can imagine just the process of getting up to speed and would have been incredible. So Ken, let's go to you in Saskatchewan. Your background getting into cabinet and your experience. At one point you were the finance, so the key economic portfolio. What was your experience, and how did you find the transition into the executive?
Okay, very quickly, forming the Saskatchewan Party in 1997, I think, thank you, was a great opportunity for me and I think all of my colleagues, because in 1997, forming the party, I mean, we were all, there were 8 elected MLAs that formed the party, gave us an opportunity to build the party from the grassroots. And by 2007, after having spent 12 years in opposition in total, but from 1997 to 2007, of course, the 10 years, it gave our group, my colleagues, a chance to experience opposition. You asked the question, is there something in opposition that prepares you? And I think what it prepares you is to understand that in opposition that you can't make the changes that your constituent want or that you want. So in 2007, when Premier Wall and the Sask Party were
I think Ken, we may have lost you. Your sound was not great. So as we keep on the panel, if you could find headphones that could plug in. That sometimes helps. But I think we got a good overview, and we're going to dive into the questions here in terms of your role in cabinet, in terms of building trust for the government. I want you to all go back to one of the more divisive times in your time in government, where there was a really difficult question to be asked. You know, yesterday Premier Stelmach talked a little bit about the royalty review in Alberta, and how the cabinet tried to bridge the needs of the province alongside the political realities and alongside your caucus colleagues, your backbench colleagues that weren't in your cabinet discussions, how you tried to balance that off. Suzanne, let's go back to you, because you talked about if you could get through caucus, you could get to the public and make your case for whatever public policy it was. Talk about a challenging time, whether it was on an energy file. Premier Clark talked a little bit about the importance of Indigenous reconciliation, economic reconciliation. Can you talk about an experience where there was a real challenge bridging the public need and what caucus was saying?
So not so much what Caucus was saying, but I'll tell you one of my more challenging panels. But first, I just want to acknowledge what Stephanie just said about time to set up your constituency office and get to know your constituency. When you go straight into cabinet, you don't have that. And that was extremely challenging, as a matter of fact, because you've got a new riding. I was new in the riding, a new riding association, new constituency, new everything. So there's those calls coming in all the time. Meanwhile, I'm now the Attorney General with all these other responsibilities. So it was actually pretty challenging in terms of time management and making sure you covered all the bases. I would say the most challenging, but also the most interesting file I had, it wasn't so much the cabinet and caucus that I had to please on this one, but it was the public. And that was, we had in British Columbia, you will probably remember the inquiry by Wally O'Toole on the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And it was a very, very difficult time in British Columbia. There were a lot of families that were really suffering. When I came in, I was minister responsible for that file. In fact, the whole time I was there, I came in when the report had just come out. And so it was implementation of those matters, changes to policing, but also just to make sure that people that people knew that the government cared. And so we did have some pretty interesting meetings with all of the people who had, the families and the supporter groups and so on, because they were very skeptical of government and very skeptical of our response. And so as a cabinet minister, when you're dealing with the public on any kind of issue, you need to be clear about what your response is, and you want to try and remove that skepticism, because we really did obviously want to do the right thing and what was the best thing. So it was hard because people were suspicious. And I would say, going back to the theme of trust, one of the things that I always tried to do, and what really helps a government and helps cabinet ministers, is if you can speak clearly to the public and answer questions properly. Don't deflect and don't just give your talking points. We see plenty of examples of both in our current Canadian political scene. And really, you have to be able to answer questions. I will tell you, I strongly disapprove of politicians who go straight to their talking points. That does not build public trust. What builds public trust is people can hear what you're saying. They might hate it, they might like it, but at least they understand what you're saying.
That's a great point. And in fact, often I think you build more trust with the public if you acknowledge, in some cases, where there were mistakes made or where you fell short. It's better to be completely honest. Let me ask you one final thing before I move on, Suzanne. You talked about a very challenging time, the missing and murdered, and of course in British Columbia, the Highway of Tears. Was it more difficult if you did something that was contrary to the advice of Justice O'Toole or something, or if you were phasing something in? Was the challenge sometimes articulating why you were taking a certain course of action?
Well, every time, yes. So everyone who's been in politics and gets a report, an outsider report written by somebody else, not written by staff, it will come in. I think there were 67 recommendations. And that's always the case with external reports. You can't control them, obviously. Mm-hmm. And so many of the recommendations were pretty good, like changed policing to, I can't quite recall the details now, but just so that policing would be more responsive, so that missing persons files would be treated properly, so on. So those things we could do, but there were a lot of sort of detailed how-to recommendations. And people would get quite grumpy if you didn't get to every single one of the recommendations. You can't do that. So that there's a little bit of explaining to do. But I think if people see that you're handling the big picture, at the end of the day, that's what really matters.
Yeah, no, that's always the challenge when there's a list of 67 or something like that, and you proceed on 8, justifying that. Let's go to you, Dave, and your experience in Manitoba. Was there, yesterday Premier Dewar spoke about the challenge of the federal gun legislation, and he used to talk about anytime Alan Rock gave a press conference, it gave him challenges with the urban-rural split in Manitoba. You don't have to choose that issue, but was there an issue where you found that your role in cabinet was bridging the public good and making sure that caucus felt the trust in the decision made by cabinet?
Yes, there was. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm going to bring into play something a little bit different that'll perhaps help explain some issues. All of us health ministers, when we came into office, we were piled upon by our public health officials to say the first thing you have to do, and it wouldn't cost you any money, is deal with smoking. Smoking is the biggest cause of death. Therefore, you should have a public non-smoking ban. Now, all of us, and I know this because I discussed this with all my fellow health ministers across the country, we all then brought it to caucus, and we're very happy to bring it to cabinet. And to my surprise and everyone's surprise, we could not get it through. And it was an example of timing is everything. It took a couple of years, and I think Jim Rondeau was very helpful in this. And it took the opposition, an opposition member, agreeing with that legislation for us to finally bring in a ban on smoking in public places. Now, in retrospect, it seems so obvious. No one likes bars or clubs or anything now filled with smoke, and it seems so obvious, but it was very difficult given some of the constraints of the restaurant community, the bar community, a lot of the economic interests that said, the gambling industry, if you take away smoking, you'll hurt our business. So it was one of those examples of a decision that seems so obvious from a public health perspective, but ran into opposition, and only timing. It took a couple years to get it through and implement it. And of course, once it was implemented, there is universal agreement with it. So that to me was a really good example of getting advice, bringing it forward, but the timing was wrong. And it took a lot of work, both the caucus members and with the opposition, in order to bring forward legislation that finally brought it about. And of course, it's now in place across the country. And to me, that was one of the more interesting policy issues that seem on their face to be so obvious, but in terms of timing and implementation were very difficult to implement. And in retrospect, everyone agrees.
Now, that's a great one to bring up. In fact, I remember all the small businesses, all the small restaurants that were proclaiming doom and gloom and that they wouldn't survive it. And so those are tough public policy decisions. But watching movies with my kids, they almost can't believe that people used to smoke in these places. So as you said, people used to smoke in restaurants and planes, and that's a great example of public policy and timing. Let's go to you, Greg. And I spoke about the royalty issue that Premier Stelmach spoke eloquently about yesterday. Was there a particular issue where, your experience in caucus, your time in cabinet, you were kind of part of the bridge to make sure that you could communicate what you were doing to caucus voices that may have had some questions?
Probably I found over my time that you could deal with a lot of issues, and we were a very large tent progressive conservative party in Alberta. So we had a broad range of, and a very large group. So a large range of backgrounds and ideas. And some of the issues that were the most difficult were the personal issues, the social issues. Because sometimes financial issues are easy to get your head around, work through. But when you come to issues that are very personal, that affect you at home or in your school or health, those are so critical. And I believe probably the most contentious and difficult time I remember as a cabinet and caucus member was when we were trying to make a determination on gay-straight alliances in schools at the time. And at that particular time, it was a huge social issue across the spectrum in politics. And we had people, of course, that were championing this very helpful idea for children to have a safe place in schools. And we also had people on the other side of the spectrum that really believed that parents had a role, and it was much more important to make sure that that was protected. And so I worked with, and we put a committee together of a group of cabinet ministers and members of our caucus to try to bridge all of those different things to come up with a final solution that could try to not try to make everyone comfortable with the decision we're going to make. And as difficult as it was, we worked through it. It took some time, and we ultimately made a decision. And the world has moved on a long way since then. But it was those social issues that tended to really trigger people personally. And whether you're in cabinet or caucus, those issues really made people become involved. And so I found that working through those and working with people and being sensitive to their backgrounds, issues, and concerns was so critical to keeping a cabinet and a caucus together.
No, that's great perspective. And sometimes those difficult discussions, but when you're engaging people, are some of the most important ones, particularly when it comes to rights. Stephanie, how about your experience, including any perspective as whip? We talked a bit about discipline. Sometimes if there's a challenging decision, and in your case, you talked about how Premier Notley and the team came in basically from a social activism standpoint. Well, you caught the car, you're suddenly running an economy based on hydrocarbons and critical for the economy. Was there any specific issue that was challenging where you found your role in cabinet was bridging the demands of caucus and what was best for the province?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about our government that was probably fairly rare is that we didn't have any mandate letters. So that gave great opportunity to be creative, but it meant that there was a very small number of things that we had run on, we said we had to do, that were needed to get done. So for me, in my cabinet role, nothing that, other than dealing with payday lending, which was just very popular, and nobody except the opposition seemed to be concerned about it. So there was no, issue between caucus and cabinet on that one. I really had nothing that I had to do. So it was rare for there to be that push and pull between caucus and cabinet for me specifically. But there's two situations that I can point to. One was Bill 6, well, that was the farm and ranch legislation that we had. I was deputy whip at the time. And this was one of our very first pieces of legislation that we brought in as government, and it resulted in massive protests, people being bussed in from rural Alberta with turkeys and actual pitchforks on the legislature steps. It sounds quite funny, but I do know that those who were in cabinet at the time were quite fearful for their lives. I know that Minister Phillips at the time, she was actually being stalked. It was really, really dangerous time for our cabinet, and it required a high level of caucus solidarity. It was a really hard one for caucus to maintain that solidarity over, because of the amount of public pressure they were getting, particularly our rural MLAs. But at the end of the day, it was easy to bring folks back around and to bring our caucus back around to supporting cabinet, because fundamentally the issue was about protecting farm and ranch workers, those who wouldn't normally get coverage from the provincial insurers should they be injured on the job. So by being able to point to those sort of sentiments that we all shared, and I think that was easier for us than it was the Conservatives. Greg was speaking about how they were a large tent party. So there was a lot of, folks. I mean, you read about the time of, Klein, et cetera. It took a leader that could really bridge sort of this, more far right political leaning, and all the way to, people that would maybe be more liberal or a New Democrat. And on some of those social issues, trying to get them to come together, I've read about how difficult that can be. For us, it was a little bit easier because we were all socially minded the same way. We all had the same kind of drive. So it was pretty easy to point to the cause, the why, to get people back on side. For me,
Can I cut you off there just because I'm mindful of time and I want to hear from Ken. But believe you me, I still have some tire marks on me from the big tent of the party I led for a while.
right.
Some of these discussions are tough, and that's why I respect anyone in public service. Ken, what was your experience in Saskatchewan? Any issue that cabinet helped bridge the divide between caucus and where the province needs to go?
Right, and I apologize for the connection, but I'm not touching anything, so it's somewhere up there in Spaceland that they're affecting me here. But I'll be as quick as I can. My role as Deputy Premier and Minister of Finance, as well as here in Saskatchewan, the Minister of Finance is the Chair of Treasury Board. So when you start to look at the goals of all caucus members, and they are looking at suggesting that we should have a balanced budget in whatever year, and the cabinet ministers are coming to Treasury Board and with long lists and saying, these are the kinds of things we need to do. And as everyone knows, I mean, the revenue sources are limited for a government, for a Treasury Board. So it becomes a situation where you're trying to do a balancing act, and you're trying to ensure that caucus members, number one, do their work, do their homework back in their own constituencies, and have a better understanding of what they're asking for. And then when you go to cabinet, as Treasury Board Chair and Treasury Board members, you're trying to convince the Premier as well. Now, my role then as Deputy Premier put me in a bit of conflict sometimes, because I'm hearing the Premier in my left ear, I'm hearing Treasury Board in my right ear, and then everything else is coming from caucus. So you have to do that. There was a demand by the opposition and the auditor here in Saskatchewan that we did not do the general fund budgeting, that we would move to summary financials, and we did. And it was interesting. Even the media responded in a negative way when we did present our budget on a summary basis. And they said, well, where's the general revenue fund? We want that too. So it becomes interesting when you try to ensure that you're delivering a message to the public. And I think that's the last point I would make, Erin. As elected members, we're there on behalf of our constituents, and that's the entire province. So you try to do that in a way of balancing good discussion at caucus level meetings when you're sitting. Of course, we had caucus meetings every day, and that's the opportunity for everyone to voice their concerns or support and then move from that.
That's a great point. Yeah, because the cabinet ministers wear that double hat, is they are an MLA, an MPP, an MNA, MHA, whatever they're called in Canada, and they have the executive responsibility. This has been a great discussion. In the last couple of minutes we have, I'm going to try and end it like we did with the premiers yesterday. You're serving for the good of your community, for your province, and regardless of political stripe, I think more Canadians should admire people that step into the breach. I'd like you all in 1 minute or less to talk about something you're really proud of from your time in cabinet for your province, and something that you feel was in the public good and made the province better that you look back at with pride. I'll go back to the start of the list because I'm not going to spring this on Ken, and start with Suzanne. Maybe a reflection on something you're very proud of from your time in cabinet.
Well, we were very innovative in the Attorney General's ministry, and the piece that we did that was brand new was the Civil Resolution Tribunal. So rather than having a small claims court and have things go through court, we now have a very quick process where you do everything online and you have an online hearing. So mostly with disputes, particularly small disputes, what people want is an answer. And the Civil Resolution Tribunal in BC gives them that answer. So that came in under when I was Attorney General, very proud of it. And just by concluding, let me say, I loved being a cabinet minister. I loved being Attorney General. I was very sorry when the voters chose a different team in 2017. I just felt it was such an honor and a privilege to be able to have that position. And it really, I think it's the best job of your life. So don't regret a minute of it. And very, very happy that I was talked into running in 2013 and that I did run. So thanks, Erin. Pleased to see you on this panel.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, for your public service. And as a lawyer myself, and I know you would take this away, your impact on the administration of justice will continue and is making probably saving a lot of grief and money and time of the courts. So thank you. How about you, Dave? You had a very long, distinguished career in Manitoba. Can you, in 1 minute, look at one thing you did, whether it was in health or one of the other portfolios, that has made a lasting difference for the province?
Yes, I think the one thing I'd like to mention is the agreement we had with the province of Alberta, particularly Gary Marr, where we agreed that all provinces in Canada could not do specialties in all things. And therefore, Manitoba would get a gamma knife, where Alberta would send its gamma knife patients to Manitoba, and Manitoba would send its pediatric heart patients to Alberta to get their surgery, thereby two specialties in the country that we shared that allowed us, and this was as a result of something that Gary and I and other health ministers had talked about. We couldn't be the best in everything, but if we shared across the country, we could help improve the healthcare system. So the gamma knife in Manitoba, where Alberta sent their patients, and other Western Canada provinces sent their patients, and us sending our patients to Alberta, I think was a concept that has really worked and I think should still be continued. And thanks to the flexibility of the Premier of Alberta and the Premier of Manitoba, who announced it, I think that was one of the best programs that we implemented. Thank you. And it's been an honor to be with this distinguished panel.
Well, thank you, Dave. I think we need more best practices in healthcare because some provinces are doing it better than others. And why wouldn't we leverage and learn and share and collaborate? Some of the innovation shouldn't be something we fear. It should be something we embrace if we can do it in our public system. Going across to you, Greg, anything you can look back on in your time in cabinet with some pride?
I think probably one of the highlights, and it won't sound very exciting, but when we rewrote the Municipal Government Act to really enable municipalities to do more, to serve their people more, I was really pleased that we were able to get that through and get it completed and work with over 400 municipalities to do it. I firmly believe that municipal government is, if not the most important, it is so critical to the well-being of citizens, and they deliver services right on the ground where you need them. And a Municipal Government Act that enables that was one of the highlights, even though it was just a lot of hard work. And it's not nearly as exciting as some things. I think it's really an enabling legislation that continues to this day to make municipalities more responsive to the citizens.
That's a great answer. And you came from Lethbridge Council. There's a few of you came from municipal. Making an impact on that interplay, I think, is a nice lasting legacy. Stephanie, how about you and your time in cabinet as part of the Notley government?
Okay, I have two really quick. One was banning door-to-door energy sales. I personally was so frustrated with those people coming to my doors, and we saved a lot of vulnerable people from really scammy contracts. So I was really proud of that. And then the other was the X identifier. So we were the first province, the first jurisdiction in North America to bring in the ability for people to identify with a non-binary gender identifier. The way that came about was that the ministry came to me and said, hey, we want to expand the list, make it easier for people to change their gender identity. And I actually kind of misunderstood what they said. I was like, oh, great. So like a third gender identifier. And they were like, no. And I was like, yes, we're going to do that. And now other jurisdictions have followed suit. And I still receive emails from people reaching out to me about how it's changed their life. So really proud of that. Thanks.
Well, that's a reminder that the buck stops with the minister, and sometimes the minister will say, no, this is what's happening, and a good example of your ability to make progress. Ken, back to you from a distinguished time as in many roles in the executive in Saskatchewan. Can you point to one experience that you feel is making a lasting impact for the province?
Two things in finance and one as Deputy Premier. As I've already mentioned, summary financial budgeting. Saskatchewan has a significant number of crowns, and the communication through a budget that this is the entire financial picture of the province was needed, and I was very proud to be the minister that led that and delivered that first budget. Also, infrastructure funding. That was a push, a personal push, and had the support. We knew we had to build hospitals, schools, and highways, and on, and a lot of dollars were communicated. My role as Deputy Premier, I had responsibility for what we called the Ukraine file. And I had to travel to Ukraine on 3 different occasions to re-sign agreements, not only trade agreements, but education agreements. And I think what it developed was that relationship between Saskatchewan and Ukraine, and we're seeing it. Our province continues to grow, and not only in population, but now over 16% of our population trace their heritage back to Ukraine. So I'm proud of the fact that we continue that relationship with Ukraine, and as I mentioned, it has already led to something of a bigger challenge for me as the honorary consul.
That's a wonderful way to end it. I'm really proud that Canada was the first country to recognize the independent Ukraine in the Mulroney government. And our head of state at the time was a Saskatchewaner, Ray Natishin, who came from Ukrainian Canadian ancestry. So what a great part of our legacy. Well, listen, this has been an excellent panel. I want to thank Ken, Stephanie, Greg, Dave, and Suzanne for great discussion of some of the challenges and things that would have given you stress from the first day to the last day of your time in cabinet, but also part of the impact you've made on your province. Things are tight now on social media, and people like to take shots at public officials, but I think we need good people to step forward to serve their communities and their country, and you've all been an example of that. So thank you for participating. Thank you to the folks that have been watching, and thank you, Gary and Canada West Foundation, for advancing this important issue of building trust in our public institutions. And I think if you're ready, we're able to go to the last panel. All right. Well, listen, welcome to our next panel in this series on trust in government, trust in our institutions, and building a legacy of trust from the elected official through to the public. Today, we have a panel of perspectives from the backbench, although I don't even like that term. If you have the honor to have a seat in your assembly, in your house, it is a real honor, whether that's in the back corner by the curtains, which was where my first seat was in the House of Commons in Ottawa, or whether it's in the front, 2 sword lengths away from the opposition. It's an honor to serve, and we have a really good panel where we're going to talk about an individual MLA, an individual member of the backbench having an impact on public policy and building trust for government. It's my privilege to host this. Erin O'Toole, the former leader of the Conservatives and opposition leader. And today we have a distinguished panel made up of Jim Rondeau, an MLA from Manitoba, who also had experience both in the backbench and cabinet. We also have Frank Whitehat, an MLA from Manitoba from 2009 to 14, also experience as chief and leadership with the Opaskwack Cree Nation in Manitoba. And finally, we have Karen McPherson, who was an MLA in Alberta. And Karen can talk about her time in a couple of different caucuses and her perspective from the backbench. So welcome to this panel, each of you.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with you, Karen. You popped up first. So you were elected in 2015 and as an MLA for the NDP government, but you made decision to sit as an independent for a time and then join another caucus. Obviously, that was quite a ride politically, but it would have come from feeling that your voice in the backbench perhaps wasn't valued, or was there a decision that was made that had you veer? If you don't mind, talk us through how you were able to serve your constituents, but also make the decision on what caucus you caucused with in the legislature.
I was finding that my ability to represent my constituents felt very constrained while I was with the government caucus. And there were a couple of things that led to my decision. It was a number of issues over a matter of time. But what it came down to really was playgrounds. There ended up being over 2,000 students in my riding that didn't have a playground. And I really was unable to bring the issue forward. You know, as an MLA, we have the ability to bring people together within our constituencies. And I understood the issue quite well, but what I wasn't able to get was any traction in terms of how to resolve this issue. The other feedback that I was getting, so I was knocking doors all throughout my my tenure as an MLA, and I heard repeatedly from constituents overwhelmingly that they didn't feel heard by the government. And as their representative, I felt unable to really raise the issues that they were dealing with, especially in the economy. Alberta had experienced quite a downturn because of the precipitous fall in the price of oil. And of course, Calgary being an oil and gas economy at that time, you know, it played a very, very large part. It really impacted my constituents. And I remember talking to people that had been unemployed for a long time, and they were in the prime earning years of their life, and just felt that I couldn't effectively bring across what was happening to the people in my riding as a member of the government caucus. So I did make the decision, probably the scariest day of my life, to leave the government caucus. You know, when you're in government, you understand the power of government. And then soon understood that as a lone voice in the legislature, I wasn't going to get a lot of traction. But if I joined another caucus, I could probably elevate the issues a lot better. And after some discussions with the Alberta Party, I joined the Alberta Party in late 2017.
One final question. So how long did you sit as an independent, and did you find the rules of the legislature made it difficult as an independent to advance the interests and concerns of your constituents?
Yeah, I sat as an independent for about a month, and especially in terms of funding and the kind of parliamentary and legislative assistance I could get, I was better off joining a caucus where we had power in numbers. And even though the Alberta Party was a small caucus, we could pool our resources together, enjoy the benefits of more legislative support, and be recognized as an official party.
Okay, thank you. I have to apologize that I missed a panelist. It's sometimes hard on these virtual sessions to see everyone, and I'm going to call on her next to share her perspective. And that's June Drode from Saskatchewan, who served as an MLA and sat in 2 caucuses as well. Did a floor cross a little bit like Karen did. June, could you talk us through your switching of seats in the legislature, and if that was driven out of some of the same concerns that Karen had in terms of being able to effectively advance concerns of her constituents?
Thank you, Erin, and no problem. I understand when we're doing this virtually, it's difficult. And Karen, yes, I understand some of what you're saying. It was a little bit different for me because there was 4 conservatives and 4 liberals that felt the same way at the same time, that it was time to do something different in our province. Saskatchewan had always had the 3 parties, and we believed that there was enough of a commonality between the Conservatives and the then Liberals that we started something called the Saskatchewan Party. So it was in the second year after I'd been elected. So I started out by having to talk to my constituents about why I was leaving and why we were starting a new party. And of course, we got no help at all from the sitting government, because I think they believed that we were a threat right from the beginning, but we had a lot of work to do. Not only did we have to talk to our constituents, we had to talk to the other constituents right across the province and let them know what we were doing. So I was the caucus chair for a while, and after the next election, at the 99 election, there was more people that believed we were doing the right thing, but we still had to go right across Saskatchewan and talk to everybody. And at the same time, we were holding the government to account in the House, doing a good job of doing what you have to do in opposition, but at the same time, building new constituencies, finding new candidates for the parties, making new policies. We're a new government. We couldn't rely on the policies that was had either by the Conservatives or the Liberals. We had 5 guiding principles, and we spent a lot of time developing a policy to make sure that people knew who we were and what our goal was. So we never quite knew when we went into a room where we had a room of friend or foes. Ken mentioned a little bit about what happens when you turn your. We actually became official opposition as soon as we started the party. So it was an interesting scenario to make the then NDP government say, okay, we have to respect you. You are a party, and we had more catcalls across the House about how we'd never be seen again, because we had done this, but there wasn't a reason. I think all 8 of us at the time said we didn't get elected just to listen. We wanted to make a difference. So it was an interesting time of our lives, and something I think there was a book written about it. But when I look back at it now, it's changed the province, and it changed all of our lives.
Well said, and certainly the Saskatchewan Party has done pretty well since then. So you've had some good vision. That was more of a startup than a floor cross, really. Jim, you served 17 years in the legislature in Manitoba. What was your experience in coming into caucus and your role as a voice for your constituency right off the bat?
Well, that's quite simple. Basically, I was surprised to become a politician. I thought it would be neat to run. So we ran in a riding that had been non-NDP for the entire length of time it existed. And it was one of the first ridings in the whole province. I won by 3 votes. So therefore, I really had to pay attention to what my constituents were saying. I didn't stop canvassing. I just didn't stop being engaged. The opposition used to laugh and say, well, Jim would show up to an envelope opening. And I thought that was quite interesting. But more importantly, I think by being in the backbench for about 3 years and then getting appointed as Minister of Healthy Living, spending some time in that, I got the perspective both the backbench and as a cabinet. And I was able to work with some of my colleagues like Rob Altemeyer, who knew way more than energy efficiency and green stuff than I ever did. He worked with me when I was cabinet minister responsible for that portfolio. Melanie White worked with me very, very much as a backbencher on the payday loan file, where she got alternate lenders, and she worked down in the community. So I was really pleased to work with a number of my colleagues to move forward on issues that were important to them, and I was able to work on issues that were important to my constituency. And I think it's important to have the perspective of being in the backbench, because you really get linked to your community.
Yeah, well said. And I bet your margin wasn't 3 in the subsequent elections if you were going to the opening of every book and every envelope.
I think it worked up to 60. I think it worked up to 65% of the popular vote.
Yeah, that's a good margin to build up. Frank, were we able to get you off mute, and were you able to weigh in with your experience?
Yeah, I was in my community of Pasquia Cree Nation in the council for several years before the people decided to elevate my duties and responsibilities to chief. I did 3 terms consecutive there, and then I went on to work for Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs as political advisor to Grand Chief Ron Evans. I did that for about 4 years, and Then I was asked to come back home and run for as a candidate for the NDP, and successfully I was elected 2009. And so my first introduction into office, I had to do a 30-minute speech in the House. It was a little bit unnerving, but by that time I was used to, making public announcements and about our situations in northern Manitoba. So I represented northern Manitoba, central northern Manitoba communities, and they were quite diverse. There was agricultural community in the Paw area, Treaty First Nations, Métis Nations communities, community councils, municipal governments, First Nation governments. So I went into government with all of those concerns that were expressed by the various communities in my area there. So, but the thing was for me was how the government of the day, the cabinet ministers, the MLAs, and supporting staff, all came together to help the transition to be as smooth as possible, so I can get into the work that was required for my constituency. So that one experience there alone went a long ways in terms of representing the people at that level. So I'm very happy about that, how that went about.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Frank. Just to make sure that we can get a good discussion in the time we have, I want to talk about, so some of you, Jim served in cabinet, but I want to focus on time in the backbench and how, if there was an issue important to your constituents or to you from your own background, whether you were in government or not, because some of you were in opposition, how did you try and get an issue on the radar of the responsible cabinet minister or even the premier, if it was important for your riding or important for you as an individual? And was it, using petitions from your community, statements in the legislature, all these sorts of things? How did you use your power as a backbencher, regardless of opposition or government, to advance something that was important for your constituency? Why don't we start with June first, and I'll call each of you in to try and talk about that experience.
Thank you very much, Erin. I think most of my time as in opposition, as a backbencher, was in opposition. So it was not like I had the opportunity to know a cabinet colleague and go chat with them. We used a lot of petitions at the time, but if I have to think back on it now, I don't know if it's a really good use of time or not, but it's something that's traditional. So I guess it is what it is. I think the most important thing that you could do is make sure that you had developed some type of relationship with a cabinet minister or the House leader or somebody on the other side of the House, so you can talk with them. They have to see you as a real person, and they have to know that you're not just talking for the good of your health, but you have an issue that's important to people that the cabinet ministers are responsible for, even though they're not their constituents. And I think that's something that we all have to remember once you're elected, you represent everybody. So that was usually my opening line when I had the opportunity to talk to a cabinet minister. This is not about me. It's about what we're doing as a province. So that was an important item. And I know that as Somebody said earlier, you asked a question whether about opposition and government. The only good thing about opposition is you do have a little bit more time when it comes to actually garnering support from some of your colleagues. So when you had your chats or your dinners or whatever it is to find out what was a common concern, it's a little easier to do that. You know, if you have time to go for dinner or a lunch break. And the caucus usually had donuts there, so we'd have a chance to chat. But if we can make sure that it was something that was good for the people of the province, you don't want to you're not trying to change policy because you know that's not going to happen. But there are some things that should just be done because they're the right thing. So I guess for me, it's all about making sure people can see that you're supposed to be the voice of the people, and that the individuals on the other side of the house understand you're doing it for the right reason.
Well said. And let me ask you one follow-up quickly, June. Since you spent most of your time in opposition, was it your experience that if a minister or even the premier was in your riding, you would get invited to the event, or was it one of these you'd find out about it through the grapevine?
Usually found out later. The only person that I knew was extremely good, and I still give him credit for this day, was the speaker used to come to the constituents, come to schools, and the speaker usually would invite us in. But I can't remember any time where I was given notice that somebody's coming to your riding. That didn't happen.
No, and in fact, the odd time I would show up, and then they would say really nice things about me, but you could tell they were shocked to see me. Great perspective. Karen, how about you? Because you were in government caucus for a while in opposition. If there was an important issue for your constituency, as you talked about, how did you, as a backbencher, get it on the radar of the minister or the premier? What tools did you use to advocate?
This is a great question. I love strategies. So, of course, being a new MLA, it was really challenging to figure out, like, what are the dynamics here? Who am I supposed to navigate through to try and bring things forward? What I did find as a government backbencher was that our statements in the legislature were really quite policed, and it was difficult to get onto the docket to be able to make a statement about something. I found that politics is all about relationships. And so my relationships, both with staff and ministers, were really important in terms of getting a message across. In opposition, what I found to be extra effective was relationships with stakeholders. So being able to engage stakeholders, it actually helped me get amendments passed. And I wasn't super popular with the government because I had left them, but I was still able to get amendments passed while I was in opposition. And that was because of the relationships that I had nurtured with stakeholders on particular issues that dealt with specific bills. Introduction in the chamber, making, a little remark while you're introducing a guest in the chamber, really effective in terms of raising the profile of whatever that issue is. And I just want to speak really quickly to your question to June about being invited. When I was with the government, the minister actually showed up in my riding and no one had told me. And I will give him credit. It was David Egan. He came door knocking with me as an apology. Like, it was just an oversight of a new government. They just completely forgot to invite me. So shout out to him and his staff for making amends for that one.
Well said. I remember that even when I was in government, being a member of the caucus and finding out a minister had been in one of his colleagues' ridings and didn't even find out. So my staff knew that if I'm traveling and I'm doing some events with veterans in a riding or something, make sure the local MP is invited, regardless of political stripe, because it's the right thing to do. Great perspective on that. Thanks, Karen. Jim, how about you? I know you went to cabinet eventually, but were there techniques that you used to really advance things for your constituents? As you said, you kept door knocking. Obviously, you kept a really good finger on the pulse of your constituents. What techniques did you use to advocate to the cabinet and to the premier?
Well, one of my advantages is by winning by 3 votes after 2 recounts in the Court of Queen's Bench hearing, you become a targeted riding with the government. I agree fully with Karen, where it's all about relationships. And I do have to say that Loge inside the chamber became my favorite friend because you could access the ministers and you could talk to them on a one-to-one basis without a lot of issues. So I really, really appreciated the Loge and my colleagues spending some time. But I often found that the most important thing that I could do is not bring the problem, but bring the problem and a solution to a major issue. So you sit there and say, I got this problem in my constituency. Here's the solution, and here's how we can address it. And then I would also always bring a little piece of paper so that it was a reminder. And I know it's silly, but sending an email or sending whatever got lost. But what would happen is the minister would stick their hand in the pocket or their purse and they go, oh, damn. And then they would deal with it. And I always used colored paper. I used either yellow or orange or some bright color so that it would stick out. And by doing that, I think that we got a lot of stuff done. And even in cabinet, I continued with that because cabinet ministers are busy, government's busy. So you actually have to stand out to get any issue heard and then resolved. And then I also am very tenacious. Tenacity is my middle name. Premier Dewar called me the Energizer Bunny. The idea is to never stop and just keep at it.
That is great, and even color coding your notes. Great strategy, Jim. I'll share a quick anecdote. One of my last days in the House of Commons before I left last spring, I brought a letter to Lawrence McCauley, the Veterans Minister, on behalf of a female veteran who had her services refused, even though she was injured serving Canada. In the House of Commons, if you gave it to the minister directly in the chamber, it wouldn't go through the ATI procedures of registry. So it was considered a courtesy to do it that way. And I said, look, if you want to get rid of me, fix this. Otherwise, if you don't fix it, I'm going to hang around and bring it up every week. and so sometimes those relationships in the chamber can go a long way. Frank, what about you? Any perspective on what you did right away to advocate for your constituency?
Well, the first thing that happened was the Premier Dewar at my first election. We had a meeting and we talked about the issues in the constituency, the needs, and the concerns, and what my priorities were. So I really appreciated that opportunity to put forward what we should be working towards to resolve the matters at hand. And I also lobbied with the cabinet ministers on the pressing issues in my constituency so that they're aware of what our needs were. I think with the premiers and cabinet ministers, when they did business in my constituency, they always let me know and invited me to attend the events. So I was very much, appreciative of that consideration. One of the things that happened also was when my constituency citizens made their asks to government. I was informed and I was asked if I was aware of that, if I was in favor, agreeable to that. So that open communication for me was so important, so critical.
No, great, some great thoughts there. Thank you. Next, I want to zoom in on a challenging time in your public service. So an issue that was very controversial in the legislature or very controversial amongst some of your constituents. We hosted a panel with three former premiers yesterday, and in Manitoba, Gary Dewar spoke about the challenge when there was federal firearms legislation because there was a variety of issues, points of view on it from rural and urban perspective. Premier Stelmach talked about royalty reviews and how those things were handled. Can you think about a difficult decision in the legislature and how you as an individual MLA used your influence or how you approached it to make sure that your constituents were being heard on a really controversial or divisive issue. Let's maybe start with you, Karen, if you can think of one from your term.
So while I was in opposition, there was a bill that was introduced. It was called the Protection of Patients Bill. And the idea behind the bill was that if a healthcare professional had been found to have committed some sort of sexual misconduct, they would have to serve whatever justice sentence there was. And 5 years after that time, they would be able to reapply for their license. I had, like many people in Canada, especially women, had experienced sexual assault in my life. And when I heard that bill, it really struck me that these people should not ever get their license back because they had betrayed a sacred trust, really. And so I worked with stakeholders. I brought forward an amendment and was really disappointed that the government turned down my amendment. And that amendment would have ensured that these healthcare workers would never be able to get their license back. But it was as a result of the work with stakeholders who then applied their own pressure on the government that the government brought the amendment back. And it was passed. So now in Alberta, if there is someone who has committed some sort of sexual misconduct as a healthcare professional, they won't be eligible to get their license back. And further, I was able to get an amendment passed that ensured that the people that are sitting on tribunals with the regulatory bodies would be educated in trauma so that they would understand that the behavior of someone who's been traumatized may be different than what they're expecting. So it was a really difficult issue. It's something that people don't really enjoy talking about. But it's through relationships and through advocacy and, like Jim was saying, tenacity, that we can make changes that are really good for people and not just pay lip service.
That's a great example, Karen. Thank you. And shows the power of an individual member where you were able to rally some stakeholders, but also advocate for something that was profoundly important for you as an individual member as well. Those are great examples, and it shows there is no bad seat in the legislature if you use that platform you have, if you use that privilege. How about you, June? Was there a debate that was particularly challenging or divisive that you took a specific approach to try and make sure you could advocate in a way that was true to you and your constituents?
Thank you. I think probably the one that somebody mentioned already, smoking was a big issue, and so was text or cell phones, but that was a little later on. I think when I was first elected, the biggest issue was rural Saskatchewan and the closures of hospitals and schools in the communities. We always felt like there was that the government at the time wasn't valuing rural Saskatchewan the way that we wanted to. So there was RM amalgamations that was on the table where there was lots of people would come forward and to meetings, and we would always be there to talk about the importance of having a local voice. There was school closures, and part of it was the depopulation. But to close somebody's school down is tearing out their heart in lots of cases, and the school hospital closures. There'd been some the years before when we were before we were elected, but that seemed to be the theme of it was the interest that the government had at the time in the areas that we mostly represented. The Sask Party represented just about all of the rural ridings by the first election and part of the second. So it's not a good feeling to feel like you're representing the rural against the urban, but it was a huge issue. So I think it was probably one of the reasons why we managed to bridge that gap later on to say that we could represent all of the province. But it was difficult to sit and listen to people whose lives were changing a lot because of government decisions to close facilities, whether they, whatever the reason, affected everybody individually. So the only good thing about it is it gave us a chance to meet with individuals and to make sure they knew that we were real and that we would be representing their voice in the legislature. It's an honor that most people don't get to be able to stand up in the House and say, I recognize the member for, and your name isn't used, but you know very well that you're representing, at that time I was representing nearly 20,000 people. And that was always the goal, is to make sure that when there was a common theme, personal issues are one thing, but a common theme is something that all of us were really interested in.
Now, thank you. In your time in opposition, then, I guess you would do two things, because as you said, schools and hospitals are dear to any community. You'd try and listen with compassion and then advocate because you weren't able to have a decision changed in most cases. Would that be fair?
That's exactly fair. I mean, you go back into the house. I sort of didn't make kind remarks about petitions, but it's something that you do to make sure that people are aware that the government was aware. And member statements was another issue. And I liked what Jim said about the little notes, because that's people who don't sit in the legislature probably wonder what the pages are doing, running right back and forth across the floor to talk to somebody on the other side. They were an important part to make sure that the government was aware that we knew what was going on in an area where they don't have a representative.
Great point. And I would say that often to constituents. I raise the matter personally with the minister in the House. That goes a lot further than just saying, I got your email or I got your letter. Jim, how about you? Is there an example of a particularly challenging or divisive debate that required a very special approach from you in terms of your advocacy as an MLA?
Well, the first one was, of course, the smoking ban, but I did that as a minister. So I'll pass that to the second one, which was the same-sex rights and obligations bill. When I got elected, I was the first openly gay MLA in Manitoba. And what's interesting is that there was the federal ban on, and there was a federal judgment on, and a provincial judgment saying that we had to change the marriage rules. And I was able to work with my caucus, the premier, and say, okay, it's not just about marriage, it's about a bigger thing. So we mobilized lots of people, and it became the rights and responsibilities, so that we were actually the same-sex rights and responsibilities, and we changed 185 statutes all in one fell swoop. And we did it by focusing not on rights, but focusing on being equitable in society and not having a difference because of anything. And I was pleased to, Nancy Allen and I chaired the public hearings. We did probably about 8 weeks of public every evening hearing about it. But we heard about what was happening with relationships that would break down and people would swoop in and take their partner's assets. That we heard all sorts of disastrous things. And being able to change that and having all of our caucus stand up and the Liberals stand up with us, that was really, really important. And personally, it was really important when I got married the next year. So I think it's an interesting change of society, because now it's no one cares. Like it just is. And I think that what happened is society understood the world wouldn't end if you extended rights and obligations to everyone. And I think it was fair. And I think that was one of my biggest challenges. But when you put it into human perspective, all of your colleagues get it. And I think that was my first big win in politics on making a big systemic change, because we could have just done one law. And instead we made it right.
What a great example, and very powerful. Congratulations and thanks, Jim. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to start the last round with Frank. And I'm going to do it in this way. It's hard for me to say this to former politicians, but I'm going to give you just 1 minute where I would like you to really sum up an achievement that you're very proud of from your time in public life, preferably from your time in the backbench, but if it is time in cabinet, that's fine too. Because in this day of age where, you know, Twitter and social media is making it hard for people to step up and run, we want good people to still run for office, like all of you, and we want them to know that they can make a difference. So we're going to start with you, Frank. Can you Can you point to
Okay.
one thing from your time in public life that you're really proud of?
Okay, for me, that was the Truth and Reconciliation era. This was a time of reflection and seeking the truth, you know, about the First Nation dark ages in the Canadian system. But we tackled that issue head on. The NDP government, and we managed to get all of the members in the House to agree that this mandate should be extended by Canada, and it required a province with all its MLAs to agree on this one thing, unanimous agreement, and we were able to do that. And so that Truth and Reconciliation Commission was extended because of that united effort. I'm very proud of that because now we're starting to see, you know, the full impact of this process that it's coming around in our present times. So that would be the one.
Yeah, that's going to be hard to top that one, Frank. That's had an impact in your riding, in your province, and in the entire country. So thank you. How about you, June? One reflection that you're really proud of from your public life.
Well, I do have a private member's bill passed on recognizing FASD, which I'm proud of because that takes a lot to have a government to agree with an opposition member. But for me, I think that it's the fact that the social issues. I have the world's first social impact bond, or Canada's first social impact bond, and recognizing that we don't use the word disabilities, we use the word abilities for different people. The whole idea of individuals having rights, and I think that is, for me, the most important thing is if I think about. I have no regrets that I'm gone, but that's the type of thing that makes me happy when I go to bed at night.
Wow, it should. That's a very impactful private member's bill. Your social impact. We need you to run again, June. You should get back in the legislature. How about yourself, Karen? You obviously talked about that amendment you worked very hard on. Is that might be it? Is there one issue that you can really point to with pride from your time?
That definitely stands out. I think also the fact that, you know, I took a stand for my constituents and I left the government caucus because I didn't think I was being effective. You know, in retrospect, I'm pretty proud of myself, that person that I was at that time, because it took a lot of courage to do that. And being able to, you know, stand up in the legislature and freely articulate what was important for the people that I represented. I'm really proud of myself for having done that.
Well said. Free speech, advocacy, and passion, a mixture of all three. So well done. Jim, you may have already stolen your own thunder with that incredible bill advancing rights in Manitoba, but is there another reflection, or is that it from your time?
I have one that's really quite interesting. I was just appointed as like a junior health minister, healthy living minister with Dave. And I was sitting there with Lisa Raitt at my first federal provincial meeting. And she said, "Hey, I want to make a difference." And I said, "Yeah, I want to make a difference." And she said, what do you think we should do? And that's when we expanded, we set up a deal to expand all the free flu shots, all free vaccines, and make it available to everyone. And we told them that we'd give the data to the feds. And it was a great example of an NDPer working with a Conservative and making a huge difference. Now, no one will know that we expanded all the vaccines and made them cheaper, free across. But she did that, and we did that in the middle of a bar at about 2 a.m. in Quebec City. So thank you, Lisa.
How very Canadian, Jim. The Cape Bretoner, along with the Manitoban, in a bar in Quebec, advances public health in a great way. What a great way to end this panel. Jim, Frank, Karen, June, thank you very much. You prove once again that any seat in the legislature gives you a chance to be an advocate for your community, for your province, for your country. and to make a real difference in this day of instant critics and trolls on Twitter, on X. You're showing it's the person in the arena that counts. So thank you for your public service. Thank you for your thoughts on rebuilding and building trust. And thank you to the Canada West Foundation for an incredible series of meetings. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.